In a basement beneath the ruins of Pearl Harbor, an exhausted cryptanalyst stared at fragments of intercepted Japanese radio code and realized he was holding the future in his hands. The message mentioned AF. Somewhere, the Imperial Navy planned to strike in force. But where? Commander Joseph Rochefort made a gamble that would determine the war's outcome. He instructed Midway's garrison to broadcast a fake distress signal claiming their water purification system had failed. 48 hours later, Japanese intelligence reported that AF was short on fresh water. The trap was set. What followed was the most perfectly executed ambush in naval history. 6 minutes of dive bombers screaming from the sky, catching 4 Japanese carriers with armed bombs scattered across their decks, fuel lines open, and not a single radar screen to warn them. By the time the smoke cleared, Japan's offensive capability was broken forever, destroyed not by courage or numbers, but by mathematics, technology, and one brilliant deception. We are dedicated to keeping these stories alive. To support our research and never miss a deep dive, subscribe to the channel. Thank you for being here. Let's continue. May 27, 1942, 0300 hours. The basement of the 14th Naval District Headquarters smelled of cigarette smoke, stale coffee, and desperation. Commander Joseph John Rochefort sat hunched over his desk, surrounded by worksheets covered in fragments of Japanese kana characters. His eyes burned. He hadn't slept properly in 72 hours. Around him, the men of Station Hypo, the Navy's cryptanalysis unit, worked in similar states of exhaustion, piecing together an enormous puzzle from electromagnetic whispers captured across the Pacific. They called it JN-25, the Japanese Navy's operational code. For months, Rochefort's team had been breaking it piece by piece, not through any single breakthrough, but through patient accumulation, frequency analysis, traffic patterns, cribs, and the occasional captured codebook. By late May 1942, they could read perhaps 15% of intercepted messages. Enough to see patterns. Enough to detect something massive forming. The intercepts mentioned AF repeatedly. A target. Something the Japanese considered important enough to gather their main carrier striking force, the Kido Butai, the same fleet that had devastated Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. Intelligence from other sources suggested Midway, the tiny atoll that guarded the approaches to Hawaii. But suggest wasn't certainty, and Admiral Chester Nimitz needed certainty before he committed his 3 remaining carriers against the most powerful naval force in the world. Rochefort had an idea. Dangerous, unorthodox, potentially brilliant. He walked upstairs to find Captain Cyril T. Strayhorn, rubbing his face to wake himself. "We need Midway to send a message," he said. "In the clear, unencrypted. Something the Japanese will intercept and relay." Strayhorn looked skeptical. "What kind of message?" "Tell them their water desalination plant is broken. Urgent need for fresh water. Make it sound real. Mechanical failure. Not enough drinking water for the garrison." Understanding dawned on Strayhorn's face. If Midway broadcast this in plain English, Japanese listening posts would hear it. If they relayed it to their fleet using the AF designator, Station Hypo would know for certain that AF meant Midway. The ruse was elegant in its simplicity, using the enemy's own intelligence apparatus to confirm your deductions. On May 29th, Midway's radio operator sent the message. Rochefort's team waited, monitoring Japanese frequencies. On May 31st, they intercepted it. A Japanese intelligence report noting that AF was experiencing water shortage. Midway. It was Midway. Rochefort hand-carried the decrypt to Nimitz's office. The admiral studied the paper, then looked up at the rumpled, exhausted cryptanalyst. "You're certain?" "As certain as I can be without reading Yamamoto's mind directly, sir." Nimitz made his decision in seconds. Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown would sortie immediately for a position northeast of Midway. They would arrive before the Japanese, hide beyond the range of scout planes, and wait. When the Kido Butai struck Midway, the American carriers would already be positioned for a counterstrike. It was the perfect ambush, conceived in a basement by exhausted men armed with nothing but mathematics and intuition. The technology gap. The trap's success depended on more than intelligence. It required technological advantages that most historians overlook because they seem mundane compared to the drama of aerial combat. But warfare is decided by the boring details, the sensors that detect threats, the communications that coordinate responses, the engineering that delivers precision. The American carriers had radar. This needs emphasis because its importance cannot be overstated. In 1942, shipboard radar was revolutionary technology. The SC radar sets mounted on Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown could detect incoming aircraft at ranges exceeding 75 miles. In clear weather, this gave defenders perhaps 25 minutes of warning. In cloudy conditions, when lookouts with binoculars saw nothing until aircraft broke through the clouds at 5 miles, radar was the difference between preparation and catastrophe. The Japanese had no shipboard radar. Their carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, depended entirely on visual detection. Lookouts stood watch with binoculars, scanning the horizon. On a clear day with good visibility, this worked adequately. But the Pacific doesn't provide clear days on demand, and clouds hide aircraft perfectly until they're close enough to kill you. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commanding the Kido Butai from Akagi's bridge, was sailing blind into an ambush, and the fundamental architecture of his ships ensured he would remain blind until it was too late. The second technological advantage was more specific, the Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bomber. Naval aviation in 1942 was transitioning between generations. Torpedo bombers like the TBD Devastator were slow, vulnerable, their weapons unreliable. Level bombers flying at altitude couldn't hit moving ships except by luck. But dive bombers, aircraft that could roll inverted and plunge nearly vertically toward their targets, combined speed, surprise, and accuracy in a way that transformed naval warfare. The SBD Dauntless was engineered specifically for this mission. Perforated split flaps under the wings slowed the aircraft during the dive, preventing it from accelerating into a death spiral. This control allowed the pilot to hold the dive long enough to place the bomb sight precisely on target. The aircraft carried a single 1,000-pound armor-piercing bomb under the fuselage and two 250-pound bombs under the wings, enough destructive power to penetrate a carrier's flight deck and detonate inside the hangar. More importantly, the SBD could dive from 15,000 feet, releasing its bomb at around 2,500 feet before pulling out. This attack profile was nearly impossible to defend against. By the time ships detected the aircraft, they had perhaps 30 seconds before impact, insufficient time to maneuver, barely enough time to fire anti-aircraft guns wildly into the sky and hope. The Japanese had nothing comparable. Their Aichi D-3A dive bomber was lighter, more maneuverable, but carried a much smaller bomb load. More critically, Japanese naval doctrine emphasized torpedo attack over dive bombing. They had invested in torpedo bombers and fighters, creating a capability mismatch that would prove fatal. June 4th, 0430 hours. Nagumo launched his strike against Midway at dawn. 36 Nakajima B-5 Incate torpedo bombers, loaded with bombs for ground attack, 36 Aichi D-3 A-Val dive bombers, and 36 Mitsubishi A-6 M0 fighters as escort, 108 aircraft. The American garrison, Marine Corps pilots flying obsolete F-2A Buffalo fighters and F-4F Wildcats, along with Army Air Force B-17 bombers and B-26 Marauders hastily converted for torpedo attack, rose to meet them. The air battle was savage. The Marines lost 17 of 27 fighters, but they'd done their job. They'd forced Nagumo to look at Midway, to focus on the atoll, to believe this was the battle he'd come to fight. While the strike aircraft were inbound to Midway, Nagumo retained a reserve force on his carriers, aircraft armed with torpedoes, ready to strike any American ships that might appear. This was sound doctrine. Keep a reserve, maintain flexibility. At 0728, the first American attack arrived. 6 Grumman TBF Avenger torpedo bombers from Midway, flying low and slow, pressing attacks that had almost no chance of success against 4 carriers protected by dozens of Zero fighters and walls of anti-aircraft fire. 5 were shot down. Their torpedoes missed. At 0755, 4 Army B-26 Marauders arrived, also armed with torpedoes. 3 were destroyed. No hits. Nagumo relaxed slightly. The Americans were attacking piecemeal, uncoordinated, with obsolete tactics. His carriers were untouched. The strike on Midway would return soon, needing to land, refuel, and rearm. Then he could launch a second attack to finish the job. At 0800, a scout plane from cruiser Tone, launched late due to catapult problems, radioed a report. Sight what appears to be 10 enemy surface ships. Nagumo noted this, but didn't change his plans. Surface ships weren't a threat to carriers. But at 0820, the correction arrived. The enemy is accompanied by what appears to be a carrier. 1 carrier. Nagumo had 4. The mathematics seemed favorable. But now he faced a decision that would haunt military academies for decades. His reserve aircraft were armed with torpedoes for ship attack. His Midway strike force would return soon, needing clear decks to land. Should he wait for the Midway aircraft to return, then launch a properly coordinated strike? Or should he immediately attack this one American carrier? He chose wrong. He ordered the reserve aircraft rearmed, torpedoes removed, bombs installed for the land attack on Midway. He would recover his Midway strike, then launch everything in one massive coordinated attack against both Midway and the American ships. The hangar decks of 4 carriers erupted in controlled chaos. Deck crews manhandled torpedoes off aircraft, rolled them to ammunition elevators, sent them below to the magazines. They brought up bombs from the magazines, hoisted them onto aircraft, armed the fuses. Fuel lines snaked across the deck. Aviation gasoline, the most volatile substance in existence, more dangerous than any weapon, pooled in corners and dripped from disconnected hoses. Nobody properly secured the removed torpedoes. Nobody drained the fuel lines. Nobody closed the hangar doors. There wasn't time. The Midway strike force was inbound, their fuel gauges showing empty. If they didn't land soon, they'd ditch in the ocean. 0918 hours, the first wave. Lieutenant Commander John C. Waldron led Torpedo Squadron 8 off Hornet toward the projected position of the Japanese fleet. 15 TBD Devastators, the same obsolete aircraft that had failed at Midway hours earlier. Waldron had no fighter escort. The F-4F Wildcats had gotten separated in the clouds. He was leading 15 slow, unprotected aircraft against the most powerful naval force in the world. He found them at 0920, 4 carriers in formation, protected by battleships, cruisers, destroyers. The Zeros fell on Torpedo Squadron 8 like predators on wounded prey. The Devastators lumbered forward at 115 knots, trying to get close enough to release their torpedoes. The Zeros shot them down one by one. Waldron died in the first 2 minutes, his aircraft exploding before he could launch his weapon. Ensign George Gay watched his squadron disappear. 14 aircraft gone. He was alone. His plane was hit, engine smoking, but he pressed forward, released his torpedo, which missed, and ditched. He would spend the next 30 hours floating in Midway's waters, hiding under his seat cushion, watching the battle unfold around him. He was the sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8. Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise arrived. 14 aircraft. The Zeros were waiting. 10 were shot down. No hits. Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown. 12 aircraft. 7 destroyed. 1 torpedo hit. a dud that bounced off Soryu's hull without exploding. In less than 90 minutes, 41 American torpedo bombers attacked the Kido Butai. 35 were destroyed. Not a single torpedo hit caused damage. Nagumo thought he'd won. The American attacks were uncoordinated, desperate, futile. His carriers were untouched. The Midway strike force had landed, was refueling. Within the hour, he could launch 150 aircraft to annihilate the American carriers. The battle was his. He was wrong. 10:24, 35 minutes. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey led 37 SBD Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise in expanding search patterns, looking for the Japanese fleet. His fuel gauges dropped steadily. Soon he'd have to turn back or face ditching in the ocean. At 10:05, he was about to give the order to return when he spotted a lone destroyer below, racing north. The destroyer was Arashi, returning to the fleet after dropping depth charges on an American submarine. McCluskey made a simple, logical inference. A destroyer racing north was probably returning to the fleet. He followed Arashi's wake like a thread through a maze. At 10:20 hours, McCluskey saw them. 4 carriers turning into the wind, preparing to launch. On their decks, aircraft crowded together, armed, fueled, ready to go. In the hangar bays below, armed bombs sat unsecured beside fuel lines and hot engine components. "Attack," McCluskey radioed. The SBDs rolled inverted and plunged. Nagumo's lookouts, focused downward where the torpedo bombers had attacked, never saw them until the scream of split flaps tearing through air became audible. By then, it was too late. 3 squadrons dove simultaneously. McCluskey's 37 aircraft from Enterprise, plus 14 from Yorktown under Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie, arriving by pure chance at the exact same moment. 51 dive bombers attacking 3 carriers in a 6-minute window. The mathematics were brutal. Each SBD carried 1,000 pounds of high explosive. 51 aircraft equaled 51,000 pounds of explosives falling from the sky with accuracy measured in feet, not yards. Anti-aircraft gunners fired frantically, wildly, hitting nothing. The carriers began turning, trying to maneuver, but ships need minutes to change course, and the aircraft needed seconds. At 10:24, the first bomb hit Akagi. It penetrated the flight deck and detonated in the upper hangar, where the armed aircraft from the Midway strike sat refueling. Aviation gasoline ignited instantly. The explosion found torpedoes, removed from aircraft just an hour earlier, stacked against the hangar wall. They exploded, their blasts tearing through the ship's structure. Within 3 minutes, Akagi was a floating torch, fires reaching 800 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt steel. Kaga absorbed 4 direct hits in rapid succession. The first bomb exploded among aircraft on the flight deck. The second penetrated to the hangar. The third and fourth hit the island structure. Every bomb found fuel or ordnance. The ship became an inferno so intense that sailors jumping overboard suffered burns from the heat radiating off the hull. Soryu took 3 hits. The first 2 struck the flight deck amidships, destroying the aircraft positioned for launch. The third hit the elevator, jamming it in the down position and trapping aircraft in the burning hangar. The captain gave the abandoned ship order within 20 minutes. In 6 minutes, 3 of the 4 carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor were destroyed. Not damaged, destroyed. The fires couldn't be controlled. The magazines began exploding. By afternoon, all 3 would sink. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, was positioned farther from the others and escaped the initial attack. Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, commanding from Hiryu's bridge, immediately launched a counterstrike. 40 aircraft found Yorktown and put 3 bombs and 2 torpedoes into her. The carrier survived the bombing, but the torpedo hits flooded compartments and reduced her speed to 6 knots. She would ultimately sink 3 days later after a Japanese submarine hit her again. But Hiryu's revenge was brief. American scout planes found her by early afternoon. At 1700 hours, 24 SBD Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise attacked. 4 bombs hit. The same pattern repeated: penetration of the flight deck, detonation in the hangar, ignition of aviation fuel, explosion of ordnance. By evening, Hiryu was dead in the water, burning uncontrollably. She sank at 0900 hours the next morning. 4 fleet carriers. The core of Japan's naval aviation capability, the ships that had dominated the Pacific for 6 months, gone. Destroyed in one day by the combination of superior intelligence, technological advantage, and precise execution. The mathematics of defeat. Naval warfare is ultimately mathematics. Resources, production capacity, time, and casualties can all be quantified. The Battle of Midway's numbers are stark. Japan lost 4 fleet carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu. These ships represented 1/3 of Japan's entire carrier force and more than half of her frontline striking power. They carried 248 aircraft, of which 228 were lost. 3,057 men died, including many of Japan's most experienced pilots, men with thousands of flight hours, combat veterans of China, Pearl Harbor, and the East Indies campaign. America lost 1 fleet carrier, Yorktown, plus destroyer Hammond, sunk by the same submarine that finished Yorktown. 147 aircraft were lost, most to the failed torpedo attacks. 307 men died. The exchange ratio was devastating: 4 carriers for 1, 780 pilots for 110. But the strategic impact was even worse. Japan's industrial capacity could not replace these losses. In 1942, Japanese shipyards could produce perhaps 2 fleet carriers per year. American shipyards were already building 24 Essex-class carriers, with more planned. In aircraft production, the gap was similar. Japan would build 6,400 aircraft in 1942. America would build 47,800. More critically, Japan couldn't replace the experienced pilots. Training a carrier pilot required 18 months minimum, 300 hours of flight time, carrier landing qualifications, navigation training, gunnery practice, combat tactics. The pilots lost at Midway represented years of accumulated experience. Their replacements would have months of training and would die quickly against increasingly skilled American opposition. After Midway, Japan never again launched a major carrier offensive. The Kido Butai had been the sword arm of Japanese naval power. That sword was shattered, and Japan lacked the industrial capacity to forge a new one. The Intelligence Revolution. The victory at Midway is often described as a triumph of courage and luck, the brave sacrifice of torpedo bomber crews, the fortuitous timing that put all the dive bombers over the target simultaneously. But this interpretation misses the fundamental nature of what happened. Midway was the first battle in history decided by signals intelligence before the first shot was fired. Rochefort's deception about the water shortage wasn't just clever. It was a proof of concept for an entirely new type of warfare. The side that could intercept, decrypt, and act on enemy communications could position forces with precision, achieve surprise even when numerically inferior, and win decisively. This wasn't about breaking a single message or capturing a codebook. Station Hypo had built a system: collection antennas across the Pacific, direction-finding equipment, IBM tabulating machines for statistical analysis, linguists who understood Japanese military terminology, mathematicians who could extract patterns from noise. Rochefort's team represented the industrialization of intelligence, the transformation of espionage from individual agents stealing documents to networked sensors processing electromagnetic signals. The implications extended far beyond one battle. The same techniques that enabled Midway informed every subsequent American operation in the Pacific. Submarine captains received decrypted information about Japanese ship movements and waited in position for targets that didn't know they'd been detected. Surface action groups intercepted Japanese reinforcement convoys because American intelligence knew their routes and schedules. Even the final decision to use atomic weapons was informed by decrypted diplomatic messages showing that Japan would not surrender under conventional bombing. The war didn't end at Midway. 3 more years of savage fighting remained. But after Midway, the outcome was mathematically determined. Japan could win individual battles through tactical excellence, but couldn't overcome the fundamental asymmetry in information, technology, and industrial production. The radar advantage. The role of radar at Midway is often overlooked, but it represents a crucial technological edge. Consider the timeline of Hiryu's counterstrike against Yorktown. At noon on June 4th, Hiryu launched 18 Val dive bombers and 6 Zero fighters. They flew southeast toward Yorktown's last reported position. At 13:32 hours, Yorktown's SC radar detected the incoming raid at 46 miles, approximately 15 minutes of warning. Fighter direction officers immediately vectored 12 F-4F Wildcats toward the contact. The Wildcats climbed to altitude, positioned themselves, and attacked the Japanese formation while it was still 15 miles from the carrier. The air battle began at 13:38, 4 minutes before the Japanese aircraft could have attacked. This was warfare transformed. Without radar, Yorktown's lookouts would have spotted the attacking aircraft at perhaps 8 miles, maybe 3 minutes of warning. With radar, the carrier had 15 minutes to launch fighters, clear the deck of vulnerable aircraft, train anti-aircraft guns, and position the ship optimally. The difference between 3 minutes and 15 minutes is the difference between surprise attack and prepared defense. The Japanese had no equivalent capability. When McCluskey's dive bombers attacked at 10:24, Nagumo's first warning was the sound of split flaps air braking at 220 knots. His anti-aircraft gunners had perhaps 30 seconds to acquire targets, track them during violent evasive diving, and fire accurately at aircraft pulling out at high speed and low altitude. It was impossible. After the war, captured Japanese officers repeatedly cited the lack of shipboard radar as a critical factor in their defeat. Admiral Matomi Ugaki, Yamamoto's chief of staff, wrote in his diary, "If we had had radar like the Americans, the outcome might have been different." This assessment appears in multiple post-war interrogations and memoirs. Japanese commanders understood they'd been fighting a technologically superior enemy, and that courage couldn't compensate for sensors that saw through clouds and darkness. Precision from altitude. The SBD Dauntless deserves particular attention because it represented a revolution in naval warfare. The ability to deliver precision strikes against moving targets from high altitude. Previous naval aircraft attacked in one of two ways. Torpedo bombers flew low and slow, releasing their weapons at ranges measured in hundreds of yards, hoping the torpedoes would track to target. Level bombers flew at altitude and released bombs from level flight, accepting that hitting a moving ship was essentially impossible. Accuracy was measured in hundreds of feet, and ships could maneuver out of the way. Dive bombing changed this equation. An aircraft diving at 70-degree angle, descending at 220 knots, could place its bomb sight directly on target and hold that alignment during the entire dive. Release altitude was flexible, anywhere from 5,000 to 2,000 feet, depending on anti-aircraft fire, but the principle was consistent. Point the aircraft at the target, hold steady, release, pull out. The SBD was engineered specifically for this profile. The perforated split flaps were the key innovation. When deployed, they created immense drag, slowing the aircraft's terminal velocity to around 240 knots. This was crucial because at higher speeds, the aircraft became uncontrollable. Small stick inputs caused violent oscillations. At 240 knots, pilots could make fine corrections, tracking moving targets, compensating for wind. The bomb load was optimized for carrier attack. The 1,000-pound ANM-65 bomb was armor-piercing, a hardened steel case designed to penetrate a carrier's flight deck, typically 2 inches of steel over 3 inches of wood, before detonating. The two 250-pound bombs under the wings were general-purpose explosives, effective against unarmored structures. Most importantly, the SBD was survivable. Unlike torpedo bombers, which had to fly straight and level at wavetop height during their attack run, dive bombers attacked from above, dove at high speed, and pulled out at low altitude, traveling at maximum speed. This profile minimized exposure to anti-aircraft fire. At Midway, of the 51 SBDs that attacked the Kido Butai, 44 returned to their carriers. The loss rate was 13%, high by peacetime standards, acceptable in combat, and dramatically better than the 86% loss rate of the torpedo bombers. The Japanese had no counter to this capability. Their Val dive bombers carried smaller bombs, had less controlled dives, and lacked the structural strength for the extreme maneuvers required. More critically, Japanese carriers had no effective defense. The Zero fighters were optimized for dogfighting, not for intercepting diving aircraft. The anti-aircraft guns were inadequate. Most were 25mm machine guns with poor high-altitude performance. The result was a capability mismatch that proved fatal. American dive bombers could strike Japanese carriers with relative impunity. Japanese dive bombers faced radar-directed fighter interception and massed anti-aircraft fire. The mathematics favored the Americans overwhelmingly. Aftermath. The Broken Sword. The battle continued through June 6th, with various skirmishes between surface ships and aircraft. Cruiser Mikuma was sunk by air attack. Heavy cruiser Mogami was severely damaged. Several American ships took minor damage from long-range bombardment. But the decisive action had occurred on June 4th between 10:24 and 10:30 hours. Those 6 minutes determined the Pacific War's trajectory. Japan's response to the defeat revealed how profoundly it had shaken their strategic calculations. The Midway operation was initially conceived as a trap for the American carriers: draw them out, destroy them, break American morale, force a negotiated peace. Instead, it became a demonstration of how thoroughly American intelligence and technology had negated Japanese advantages in experience and tactical doctrine. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commanding from battleship Yamato, 300 miles behind the carrier force, absorbed the reports of all 4 carriers lost and made a decision that speaks volumes about what had changed. He ordered a general withdrawal. Yamamoto still had battleships, cruisers, destroyers, a surface fleet that outnumbered and outgunned anything the Americans could muster. But without carriers, without air cover, those ships were vulnerable to land-based aircraft from Midway and carrier strikes from the remaining American carriers. The battleship era was over. Surface ships without air cover were targets, not threats. This realization that the fundamental nature of naval power had changed permeated Japanese naval thinking from Midway forward. They built more carriers, but never achieved the balance of industrial production, technological innovation, and operational experience that had made the Kido Butai dominant. The sword was broken, and Japan lacked the forge to remake it. Legacy: the mathematics of modern war. Midway established principles that remain relevant 80 years later. Wars are won by the side that knows more, calculates better, and acts faster. Technology multiplies capability. Radar extends human senses. Cryptanalysis penetrates enemy security. Precision weapons deliver force efficiently. Industrial capacity determines sustainability. The side that can replace losses faster wins the long war. These aren't romantic notions of courage and sacrifice. They're cold calculations of advantage and efficiency. The torpedo bomber crews who died attacking the Kido Butai showed immense courage, but courage without adequate weapons accomplished nothing except creating casualties. The dive bomber crews who struck at the perfect moment showed equal courage, but their courage was enabled by technology that let them deliver 1,000-pound bombs with accuracy measured in feet. The lesson isn't that technology wins wars by itself. Station Hypo's cryptanalysts needed brilliant intuition to devise the water shortage ruse. McCluskey needed exceptional airmanship to find the Japanese fleet when his fuel gauges showed empty. The dive bomber pilots needed steady nerves to hold their dive angle while anti-aircraft fire exploded around them. But all these human factors operated within technological and informational frameworks that either enabled success or guaranteed failure. Japan's fundamental error was believing that superior training, combat experience, and fighting spirit could overcome material disadvantages. They were wrong. By mid-1942, American technology had reached parity or superiority in most areas: carrier aircraft, radar, cryptanalysis, damage control, logistics. American industrial capacity was orders of magnitude greater, and American intelligence was systematically penetrating Japanese operational security. The outcome was determined not by any single battle, but by the cumulative mathematics of a long war where one side could replace losses and the other couldn't. Midway accelerated this process by destroying irreplaceable assets, experienced pilots, fleet carriers, operational momentum in a single day. Conclusion: the perfect ambush. Return to that basement beneath Pearl Harbor, where Joseph Rochefort stared at code fragments and conceived a deception elegant in its simplicity. Send a fake message. Wait for the enemy to relay it using their code. Confirm your hypothesis. Spring the trap. The Battle of Midway was won by a cryptanalyst with a hypothesis: radar operators tracking invisible aircraft, dive bomber pilots who could hit targets the size of tennis courts from 15,000 feet. It was won by industrial capacity that could build 24 fleet carriers while Japan struggled to build 2. It was won by training systems that could produce thousands of qualified pilots per year against an enemy who couldn't replace the hundreds they lost. This is modern warfare, not the clash of heroic individuals, but the collision of systems: intelligence networks against security practices, industrial bases against resource limitations, technological innovation against doctrinal rigidity. The side with superior systems wins, regardless of courage or sacrifice. The torpedo crews who died at Midway deserve honor for their sacrifice. But their sacrifice accomplished nothing tangible. Not a single torpedo hit, not a single carrier damaged. They died bravely, attacking with inadequate weapons because their commanders had no choice but to commit them. The dive bomber crews who arrived 6 minutes later at exactly the right moment accomplished everything. They sank 3 carriers in 6 minutes, not because they were braver, but because they had better technology, better timing, better information. They were unknowing beneficiaries of Rochefort's deception, McCluskey's navigation, and radar operators who'd positioned fighter cover optimally. War is mathematics. Midway proved it. 4 carriers versus 3, with one side knowing exactly where the other would be, with technological advantages in detection and precision attack, equals one side winning decisively. The mathematics were inescapable. The outcome was inevitable once Rochefort confirmed that AF meant Midway. The perfect ambush. Conceived in a basement, executed at 10:20, 4 hours on June 4, 1942. 6 minutes that changed the war. 35 minutes that broke Japan's sword. All because someone looked at fragments of code and thought, what if we could make them tell us what we need to know?